Hi everyone, and welcome to the ViaMonstra office hours. This is where you can ask questions on anything related to MDT, ConfigMgr, Intune, Azure, PowerShell, in general, Microsoft infrastructure, imaging, and whatnot. My name is Johan, and I'll be your host for your next hour here. So I'm ready to take your questions. Right, so please bring in your questions. I'm monitoring the Zoom window. For those of you that attended the Zoom meeting here on the ViaMonstra Academy, I'm also monitoring Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So feel free to use those channels as well if you prefer to add in or watch the stream there and ask your questions there. For those of you on Twitter, unfortunately, I cannot monitor those questions coming in that way because the platform simply doesn't support it, at least not yet. But anyway, please, if you have any questions, let me know. In the meantime, I'm going to switch over to my demo environment a little bit here. And while we're waiting for the first question to come in, I do like to mention that we have published all of our quarter courses or Q2 courses now in the Academy. So there are 8 of them in total. And we have some nice free mini courses coming up as well, starting off with a mini course on building the perfect lab for ConfigMgr and Intune, which takes place on Tuesday, April 5 at 9 a.m. Central Time. And this is a quite fun course to present. It's a big passion of mine, developing these hydration kits and solutions for years and years and years. Just shorthand version, the ability to spin up a lab real quick without having to do a whole bunch of clicking to get something going. And this is basically how I work pretty much every single day. I'm playing around in different lab environments, verifying and testing things before it's time to actually bring things into production. And this is the way I've been learning myself personally for the past 30 some years on various topics related to consulting work, really. Obviously, when I started, virtualization was not very big. I had a bunch of rack servers at home instead. But these days, it's so easy to have a lab. Single host, you get you quite far. All right, let's see. There is a question coming in on LinkedIn. It's from Ian. Wanted to clarify when ConfigMgr is going to be retired and going basically full-blown Intune. I do not think ConfigMgr will go away anytime soon. If I have a personal guess, it'll be at least 10, 15 years until we see anything like that being announced, if not more. There are simply too many environments out there that are heavily relying on ConfigMgr. What I do see a big trend in the industry in general is organizations extending functionality of ConfigMgr into Intune and other type of cloud services. And while there certainly are organizations that are shifting from ConfigMgr to Intune to have a little bit of a smaller footprint in their own data centers that they have to deal with and make a little bit easier management, there are still more and more ConfigMgr customers showing up as well as the day goes by, or the weeks and months goes by. So I really don't think ConfigMgr will go away. And if you think about it from a Microsoft point of view here, if you sell a product that is having almost 200 million some endpoint licenses being sold because it's managed by endpoints, I think you will have to be a special kind of stupid to not continue to offer that product when you have such a big revenue stream coming in from it. So yeah, I don't think it will go away. Probably not until I retire, at least. All right. Any other questions? Great question, by the way. Another follow-up comment to that one. If you want to do cloud management of servers for updates, for example, Azure does offer a few options in that area, but Intune, as you guys know, it does not support server management in terms of the usual thing you do on Intune. Tenant attached devices can surface in that platform in the console, but there is no real management of them per se unless you have something else like ConfigMgr to do that. Trevor is asking on LinkedIn, how do you feel about provisioning Windows in Azure VDI? Concerning on-prem, we use ConfigMgr, but when trying to emulate task sequences in Azure VDI provisioning, there seems to be a lot of debate about methods of doing this. I have absolutely no idea. VDI and the Azure VDI or Windows Virtual Desktop has been simply two platforms I haven't done any work on, so I don't know, unfortunately. As I mentioned a few times in these office hours, there are good resources out there. Donna Ryan would be one of them. She recently joined Microsoft in that team specifically, and she in general is really good at answering questions on Twitter and whatnot. So maybe there. Per Larsen would be a good person as well. Christian too. So yeah, sorry about that one. All right, let's see. Question coming in on YouTube. Is ConfigMgr Wim servicing any good? We have 30 DPs and we don't want to use winget or OSD Cloud or redistribute the Wim file every month. After 6 months, we can get a new updated Wim file and distribute. So I don't like the built-in servicing in ConfigMgr. And just to show you what I mean here, let me go to one of, this will do just fine. So on this server, this is a ConfigMgr 2111, I believe. I'll double check that one. Might be a 2107. Yeah, this is about 2107. And I have a few OS images added into this environment. So if I right click, for example, this one here, and do schedule updates, this is what ConfigMgr offers in terms of updating offline the images that you have on your server. The challenge with doing this, it doesn't update all the components. If, for example, it doesn't update the compatibility database and the setup engine itself, etc., etc. And it also doesn't allow you to do any sort of customizations at all to that offline image, should you want to, for example, remove a component or something like that. So I don't really like this option. I never use it myself. I prefer to either download the ISO from Microsoft every month, extract the Vim file, and replace it on my site server, and have the site server distribute out to all my distribution points this new Vim file. Or I actually do use either Winwich or OSD Builder, two very common community tools. In some environments, I have written my own PowerShell scripts to do some changes as well, because it's fully serviceable through PowerShell. And this is in fact what these community solutions are using as well. But even though it does put a lot of burden on pushing out new images out there, I do recommend to actually do this monthly and have them be replicated out to all distribution points. If you don't want to break something that you currently are deploying on, you can simply have two images or two images that you alternate in between. So once you can verify that the image number 2 is fully distributed, you can just go into your sequence and flip that around to use the new image. So I don't like having to deploy old images. I don't see the point of deploying something just to have to patch it the minute it's being deployed. I prefer to deploy an already updated image. And in terms of servicing, like upgrades from Windows 10 to 11 or servicing of existing Windows 10 or Windows 11 versions to a new version whenever they become available, uh, those images it really helps to have updated media. There are so many uh, issues that can be easily avoided by just making sure you have an up-to-date media. So even though it is a little bit painful to having to redistribute a 45 gig Wim file every month, it's definitely worth it. Definitely worth it. All right, another question coming in on LinkedIn. Virtual headsets, are they on the roadmap to be a managed device? I have absolutely no idea. I don't know. Sorry about that one. If anyone on the call or out there happen to know, feel free to put in a little comment in the chat. But I I have not heard anything about that or worked with it either. Was a follow-up question to the YouTube question earlier. Okay, you said about using two images. What do you mean by that? Well, obviously, if you use, say, so what I usually do, at least in my lab environment here, is I download a new ISO every other month, sometimes every month. And when I've done that, I have a little PowerShell script I run. And these are published on my repository as well. But it just mounts the ISO file, whatever that ISO file is, and extract the index in question that I want to extract into a new Vim file. And this will be the Vim file that I upload to ConfigMgr and create an OS image of. If you don't want to break anything while that one is distributed, you can absolutely have two images that have the same name, basically as the version 1 or version 2 or something, a number to them so you know what it is. So you can have two images of the same Vim file. And if you're updating one of them, you can have that one being distributed while the sequence is still using this one. And once that distribution is done, you can simply go into your sequence, find whatever sequence that was that you were using, and just change the image to the other image that you have. So this way you can have all the production deployments going without interrupting them while you are distributing a new image out there, even though it takes several days to get it out there, because sometimes it does. So that's one way you're dealing with it. Yeah, I hope that answered that question. There's a question here in the Zoom call. Let's see. Do you know exactly where the W server red key is getting their values from? My primaries with 4 secondaries on each running into group policy conflict errors. So in the ConfigMgr case, when ConfigMgr is set up to deal with region settings, it's actually a ConfigMgr client that is setting that configuration. So even if a group policy have been configured that register key to something else earlier, usually the ConfigMgr client will win that fight when those settings are applied. So I have seen some organizations that actually configures it through registry keys also, just in the event of a ConfigMgr agent like breaking down for whatever reason, so that the servers doesn't start to go and get updates from somewhere else, should that be the case. But in a config-man environment, when you have software distribution configured and you're using the normal software update integration in Config Manager, it's the agent that sets that particular value. All right. Let's see, some few questions coming in on LinkedIn. So I have customers going purely Intune, but I still have on-premise requirement for some for access to some application and data. What is the best VPN solutions you recommend? That would be consider machine user access tunnels and capture portal support, etc. I don't really have a preference. I work with whatever the customer happen to use in my environment. I'm in no way a VPN specialist. I know someone who is, luckily, though. On the academy, we had the great pleasure of having Mr. Richard Hicks joining us a while back. He did a free mini course on Always On VPN that talks a lot about that type of infrastructure, etc. This mini course is free to attend. It's for the community. I'm hoping I can convince Richard to come back at some point, but this session was recorded. So if you want to check that recording, this is by far the best presentation I've seen on Always On VPN. It didn't actually ended up to be a little bit more than 90 minutes. It ended up to be close to 2 hours because Richard stayed behind for about another 40 minutes after his presentation to just answer all the questions that came in. That was a very interactive session. Had a good 100 people joining. It was a great event. So if you haven't seen this one, highly recommend watching. One of the LinkedIn users actually commented back on the headset questions there, basically saying that there are some configurations available, for example, for HoloLens devices in Intune. Thank you so much for that feedback. Again, it's not something I worked with, but thank you. The community is awesome. So thank you for that. All right. Any other questions? Have a whopping 39 minutes to spare. All right, question coming in on LinkedIn. How can we integrate Intune with Defender MDM to get information about application vulnerabilities and fix them proactively? I don't quite understand the question, but there are certainly device configuration options for Windows Defender in Intune. Has been since a very long time. If you are looking into the more advanced security options, threat protection and all that good stuff, you would have to opt in and either buy a higher licensing suite, like a Microsoft 365 E5, etc., or extend your current EMS license or whatever you have with a separate endpoint for Defender license. I don't claim to be a licensing expert in any way, but there is a gentleman who works at Microsoft, Aaron Dinich. He has published what I believe is the best collection of license information I've seen for the various cloud services that Microsoft offers. And that is the quite well-known M365 maps. So depending on what you're picking here in terms of different license options, it will tell you what's built into that product. So all these different options here, they're just fantastically good overview. And Aaron has been very, very good in keeping this somewhat updated as time goes by. So happy to put this link in the chat for those of you here in the Zoom call at least, and these links we also post up on the website after the event here. So on that note, I should probably post the other link that I showed as well, this one here. That will be available also on the website when we're done with it. So we do store copies of each of these office hours recordings and links ever since we started with them back in October, November. So you simply go to the main Academy site, you find the office hours, and once you're in the course, they will be listed for every event that have happened before. So easy to find. Okay. I see David Segura happened to join the YouTube stream and tell us about what's coming to MMS. Well, there are some shiny deployment things coming to MMS, some that have not been previously displayed, and uh, David's session is definitely one of the ones you want to attend if you happen to go to Management Summit. And if you aren't going to Management Summit, try to convince your management to actually go, because that particular conference, as I mentioned, or we talked about many, many times here on the Academy, is downright the best conference there is. If you want to learn about deployment, systems management, ConfigMgr, Intune, it's just a great conference. It's held in Minneapolis early May. We basically spend 3 or 4 days inside the Mall of America. Sometimes you don't even leave the venue ever because the hotels are also inside of that building. But this is a great conference. And there will be some shiny new announcement on that conference as well. All right. Dan is having a question on YouTube. Not strictly SCCM Intune related, but have you ever seen it where you cannot mount a Vim file using PowerShell? It's been a while, but I have stumbled across it when the system I was using was too old in comparison to the Vim file I was mounting. Like you are on a 2012 R2 server and you try to mount a Windows 11 Vim file. That could be a scenario where I think that the PowerShell commandlets might not be super happy. For those scenarios, you can always install the latest ADK. So you can install the Windows ADK 11 on an older machine, and instead of using the commandlets, you can just use dism instead. And that's something I'll be using to make sure that I always have the latest servicing capabilities, even if I happen to be on a server that has an older version of Windows on it. For example, if you are on Windows Server 2019, that's really a Windows 10 1809. So that's a fairly old Windows 10 version. And I can certainly think of scenarios where you won't be able to mount a newer Vim file or do certain things with a Vim file using an older version of the DISM platform that happened to be on that server. So again, install ADK and call out that DISM file to do it specifically. So to give an example, if I go to a 2019 server, like this one here, I believe is a 2019, might be even older, 2016 even, perfect. So if I open up a a command prompt and type dism. Dang it. Can't even get the help without being elevated. That's a harsh requirement. You can see that it says that dism is super old. But if I open up an imaging tools and command prompt that you get with ADK and run the same command, dism, you see I'm now using a much newer version because the ADK version is newer than what the Windows version is. And you can even get clever and set the path to this dism command so that it always uses that one instead, and that can sometimes save the PowerShell commandlets as well. But some of my scripts have simply been lazy, and I just, if I have any dism scripts in these guys. That one. Something recently. Here's a PowerShell script where I was adding components using dism instead of using the PowerShell version. And that way I simply in the beginning of the script figured out the path to where dism was. And then I used that one. So dism path and then the command. That can typically help out scenarios like that. Let's see. A question on YouTube. What's the best way to lock the screen through a sequence? That one is fairly simple to answer. You need a Gary Block in your life. He runs the Derry Town blog. Most of you are probably familiar with it. He's been extremely active in the community, not just this one here, but also through his engagement with Recast Software. But Gary has published some clever tricks over the years to lock the screen during imaging. Maybe I should have a space in it to see more of them. Yeah, it was the same one, but this one may not be the most beautiful designed image, but it works, right? So we're happy to put, this is a little bit older, still works. Locking screen during servicing / upgrade. A question coming in from LinkedIn. CSP seems to having more effectiveness support than some native group policies. Do you find customers writing custom GPOs to utilize these CSP settings when they cannot adopt Intune or co-management yet? No, I have not seen that. I know there is a WMI bridge that you can do some scripting against, but I haven't seen any organization actively trying to use CSP policies other than the equivalent of a provisioning package without having like Intune or something else managing those policies. So unfortunately, no, I have not seen that. Let's see, there is a question coming in here on the Zoom meeting. Hi, we are starting to build more physical. Let's see here. There's an acronym that escaped my mind at the moment. Privileged access workstations and are looking at virtual privilege access workstations. Would you have any good resources for sequences to some best practices? I do not. I did see something recently about it, though. Might have been last week on Twitter. I did not find that one quickly. I mean, there are plenty of blog posts out there touching on the topic, but it's not something I have played around with and tested, unfortunately. So I'm afraid Google will have to be your friend there unless there is something in this call or attending the chats that have an idea. So sorry about that. Another question coming in from YouTube. Have you ever seen where you cannot mount an ISO file in PowerShell, but you can mount it through Explorer? PowerShell gives invalid property. I have seen, I wonder what attribute that was. It's a few years back, but I remember there was one scenario where some ISOs that you downloaded from Microsoft had a specific attribute set on them, and that attribute prevented them from being mounted sometimes. But I cannot, for the love of, figure out which one that was. Parse attribute on the file. Yeah, so basically something to look for. See what I have. I should have an ISO file somewhere here that I downloaded. It's 21H2, perfect. So copy as path, ISO, it's be an ISO file, and basically if you do get item on that one, have to be nice, and then you can ask for attributes. I should actually set the variable before I'm using it. So you can try to get rid of those and see if that helps. That's the only thing I can think of. Have I ever blogged about that? I actually did. Back in the days. This one. This was way early in the Windows 10 era where you got about the same problem when there was that particular attribute, the P attribute on the file. So I just used a bit of PowerShell to verify that. And this was what it would look in Explorer. So check that. That's the only thing I can think of. Wow, this was a long time ago, 2014, almost 8 years ago. Time flies. Super quick way to this is simply just copy and paste the file, which will remove the attribute as well. So I think I added that in here. Yeah, make a copy of it. All right, question coming in at Zoom call. What are your thoughts on the new DELL Command Update Tool? DELL advertises this to updating BIOS and drivers for DELL machines. Not quite sure if it lives up to the hype. Would love to hear your input on this. I have not worked much with that new tool. I prefer to use tools that are vendor agnostic, that work across the vendor tools. And as of right now, I'm most of the customers I work with um, um, are using this solution here, modern BIOS management, because this one works for HP, Dell, and Lenovo, and Microsoft. Not so much for BIOS. I haven't tried Microsoft, but I know it works for HP, Dell, and Lenovo for sure. This is obviously a community developed solution developed by Maurice Daly and Nikolai Anderson. But this is what I'm using in terms of getting BIOS updated. If you just have ad hoc machines, that you just a single machine that you need to do something quickly with, obviously setting up ConfigMgr environment sequences and testing and all that is quite the work. There is a good old tool, update manager for Windows, a little executable tool that you can run. And this one pulls BIOS updates and TPM upgrades directly from Microsoft Update and runs them on the machine. So it's written by David Zaratas, and it's just a helpful, cool little utility that you can run interactively on the machine. It doesn't support any automation, but if you only have a single box, you need to make sure it's fully patched. This is a great tool because it also does BIOS and firmware. So put that link in the chat for you. This is obviously not for enterprise. If you want to do the enterprise route, I recommend modern BIOS management. But I know customers actively using this when they need to have technicians that's like individual upgrades on machines without having the full enterprise solution set up yet for it. Does the time setting in BIOS play any role in setting the time zone within the OS? We are having devices that are getting re-imaged. They are in the MST time zone and are getting transferred over to the EST time zone. How can I set the time zone in a proper way during imaging? So these days, ConfigMgr has been supported for quite a while, but inside your sequences, you can definitely configure a time zone for a given deployment. If you want to have it dynamically, you can set that as a variable. It exists. It's just one of the many built-in task sequence variables. For those of you having the MDT integration, you can take advantage of that one to set the time zone. Here would be an example where you can have let's see here. For example, based on location, if I'm on these two networks, I know in Norway. If I'm on this network, I know in the US. And I can have different settings for these different locations. And one of these settings can certainly be the time zone name, which MDT has as a variable, and that will translate into the equivalent task sequence variable that sets it. Other than that, just make sure that the time itself on the computer is correct, because that can cause all sorts of other issues during deployment. Certificate issues or just similar type of errors during imaging. So some of the organizations I worked with, they actually have components already in WinPE that is making sure that the time is correct. In the PowerShell deployment solution that me and Michael has been developing, we actually are querying external time servers during imaging just to make sure that the time is correct on the computer when we deploy it. If you're doing it internally, you can do a net time to a server that you have, etc. So I hope that answered that question. Let's see what else is coming in. Okay, there is a question here coming in on LinkedIn. We've been looking at Windows 11 for Enterprise and it's been frustrating. Okay, for example, we want to manage the start menu layouts and the upgrade path, and the user experience for this is not good. How are you dealing with this in a Windows 11 environment, basically? Unfortunately, Windows 11 suffers from the same problems as Windows 10 had when it first came. The enterprise management for customizations took Microsoft several versions before they were reasonably good, and I expecting that to be the case for Windows 11 as well. Unfortunately, you would think that would be a better story around customizations, especially since Windows 10 has been available for what now? 7 years. And unfortunately, they did not. So that's not a good story right now around Windows 11. It does offer some customizations, but it's also limited in comparison to Windows 10. Right, let's see what else. I don't think I missed any questions in YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I don't see any. Oh, there you go. Matt on Facebook. Are you recommending a modified Vim file injected with many applications, or is there a way to reduce the Vim file size? So this is something we talked about quite a few times here on the office hours. The trend in the industry in general is to go away from having these thicker images into having thin images and rather deploy applications and settings at deployment time, having a fairly thin image that allows for better flexibility. But I do understand there are scenarios where you still need to have one. For example, education, school environments that may need to deploy a lab room over lunch or in an afternoon, and they need to be done with it quickly. They don't really have a choice, because in order to meet their SLA, basically to be able to deploy it quickly, they absolutely must put them in the image. That being said, there is a lot of things you can do these days to speed up deployment, even if you have a thin image. So you can start off with a very, very basic image without applications at all, just fully patched, and then find other ways to make the post-deployment go quickly. So if you have large applications, you can put applications in a Vim file. If you have driver packages, they can be put into a Vim file because it's so much faster to download a Vim file that contains 1,000 files in it compared to download 1,000 files over the network. And also modern networking, better hardware, often compensates for many of the scenarios where you, like only just 5 years ago, were forced to use a thicker image. Because the bottom line is that if you can get away of having a thin image, it makes your life a little bit easier. Because now you can just download the default image every month from Microsoft and just use it as is. Recommend exporting the Vim file that you need, the index that you need, but other than that, you don't need to do any customizations of it. So that's my take on that, that rather focusing on finding other solutions to speed up the process compared to having a thick Vim file. Sometimes it's as easy to just enable a little bit peer-to-peer in your environment so that you have content coming from multiple sources at the same time without those sources having to be servers. Just happen to be machines that you deployed earlier. And that speeds obviously up imaging a lot as well. So embracing other solutions is a good tip there. Question here in the Zoom meeting, how can we properly manage machines in a DMZ zone scenario using ConfigMgr and Intune? Well, if you want to manage sort of a separate network, commonly used for servers, for example, there are basically only two options there. Either that network must open up the needed firewall ports to ConfigMgr so that some of these servers can talk to the rest of the ConfigMgr infrastructure. So it's quite common, especially back in the days where you had like the old way of doing internet-based client management, that you would put out a distribution point, a management point in that network, and then just open up the needed initial configurations that needed to happen for those machines. I have actually seen CMG be used in this scenario as well, using the Cloud Management Gateway to basically treat those machines as internet machines, even though they definitely are not internet machines per se, but just open up a different way for them to access that kind of infrastructure. So that would basically be that. Either go old school, complicated infrastructure, or using a CMG or something like that for those machines. David Segura is commenting on YouTube as well. Absolutely agree. Move away from custom Vim files if you have the chance to do so. That is definitely a recommendation. What's a question regarding winget? Does winget command line have the ability to update Microsoft Store apps, even if the Microsoft Store is disabled by group policy? I don't know, but my guess would be that as long as you disable the store on the user level and not the computer level, I'm assuming that any command that can initiate an update will happily do so. As long as you don't do disable of the store on the machine level, but rather on the user level, you should be good there. But I have not tested. If anyone have, please let me know or put a little comment in the chat. Yeah. All right, any other questions? We have 7 minutes to go. Was a follow-up comment regarding the Vim files. This particular environment, the Vim file was almost 60 gigs in size. And yeah, when you're reaching those sizes of images, it's kind of hard to have a thin image and do everything post-deployment. But by all means, explore what you can do, because if you Vim the apps, etc., that I mentioned earlier, you can actually get some significant speed of that deployment without having to cram everything into the Vim file. So, well worth exploring, I think. And then there was a question, is 60 gig Vim file normal? No, I wouldn't say normal, but it's not unheard of. A lot of education organizations I work with, they have images spanning everything from 510 gigs up to 75 gigs. The largest image I've seen ever was 450 gigs. That was an internet cafe deploying gaming machines that have all the games preloaded in them so they can set up new machines quickly. But I rarely see over 100 gigs in an image size. Um, and when you start to have image packets that large, it starts to be interesting also what ConfigMgr can actually deal with a reasonably good reliability. So I would rather break out that into separate objects that I deal with separately. Yes, because just the sheer amount of data, that's a large file. 60 or 75 gig Vim file, that's a big image. Probably have quite many files in it as well. All right, any other questions? 4 minutes to spare. I don't see any other questions coming in. Next week we are running at the same time as today. So next Wednesday, 4:30, and the following week we'll do one of these morning sessions to give folks in Europe a chance to join without having to stay up late in the evening. But other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for the many good questions, and I hope to see you guys again next week. So thank you very much.